17 days. That's how long it took for first contact to be made from the outside world. According to a 2015 report from CNN, a group was trapped under more than 2,000 feet of earth, rock, and debris while they awaited resolution. Resolution that would end in rescue, or resolution that would end in death. None of them knew for sure which one of these eventual realities would come to pass. All they knew is that they were in a situation that was completely out of their control while they waited for any signs of rescue. This was the grim reality that faced 33 miners trapped for a total of 69 days inside of a copper and gold mine in Copiapo, Chile in August of 2010. As the world waited over the course of those days to understand what would become of those men, they too assuredly spent a great deal of time pondering if their next days at the bottom of this mine, or even their next moments, would be their last. It's truly difficult to imagine the helplessness they must have felt in those weeks. Let me ask you, have you ever found yourself in an impossible situation? Not a difficult situation, but one in which circumstances are completely out of your own control, and you're entirely at the mercy of something or perhaps someone else. Well, as we begin to delve into the scriptures, we find a man named Job who likely encountered many of these same doubts and anxieties those Chilean miners felt in the midst of their trial. The book of Job is part of Hebrew literature that gives us an important glimpse into the character of God during times where we experience great trial. Now, leading up to the 23rd chapter of Job, where I'm going to begin reading, we understand that Job was a good and righteous man in the eyes of God. He had great wealth, great health, and he was, by all accounts, given a charmed life from God. Now, as a test of Job's faithfulness, Satan was allowed to strip Job of all of his stuff, all of his belongings, all of the things that he was blessed with, as a test of righteousness and devotion to God. By the time we arrive to chapter 23 of Job, he's lost everything he owned, his entire family, his health, and even his good reputation. Alone and in considerable emotional and physical anguish, Job begins to speak of his plight. Starting with verse 1, it says, "Job spoke again, my complaint is still a bitter one, and I try hard not to groan aloud. If only I knew where to find God, I would go to his court. I would lay out my case and present my arguments. Then I would listen to his reply and understand what he says to me. Would he use his great power to argue with me? No, he would give me a fair hearing. Honest people can reason with him, so I would be forever acquitted by my judge. I go east, but he's not there. I go west, but I cannot find him. I go to see him in the north, but he's hidden. I look to the south, but he's concealed. But he knows where I'm going, and when he tests me, I'll come out as pure as gold, for I have stayed on God's paths, and I have followed his ways, and not turned aside. I've not departed from his commands, but I've treasured his words more than daily food. But once he's made his decision, who can change his mind? Whatever he wants to do, he does, so whatever he will do to me is what he's planned. He controls my destiny. No wonder I'm so terrified in his presence. Whenever I think of it, terror grips me. God has made me sick at heart. The Almighty has terrified me. Darkness is all around me. Thick, impenetrable darkness is everywhere." Now, without a doubt, this is a very challenging passage from Scripture, and often we are quick to study sections of the Bible that give us a little more immediate injection of hope. But here, with Job's pained words, we are met with the reality of the suffering that is part of the human experience. You see, Job reminds us that none are exempt from the hardships of life, even the most upright among us. Yet we can also learn from his words what it means to suffer as a follower and a worshiper of God. So how do we respond when we are faced with an impossible circumstance? I would argue that the proper response is to seek God with every ounce of energy and trust in his overwhelming goodness, despite our circumstances. But why should we? And that is the question that I would like to tackle for you. Why should we trust God when we cannot see him in even the darkest and most dire of circumstances? I want to give you 3 reasons. First, we can understand that the doubts that we experience in hardship are ultimately what drive us closer to God. Doubt is not something that we should be ashamed of or afraid to experience. Writer Julia Baird once wrote, "If we don't accept both the commonality and importance of doubt, we don't allow for the possibility of mistakes or misjudgments. While certainty frequently calcifies into rigidity, intolerance, and self-righteousness, doubt can deepen, clarify, and explain." Now, all of us encounter doubts about God at one time or another. And as we observe Job in this chapter, we see that he continues to wrestle back and forth with his faith in whom he believes God to be and his perception of God's inaction in his life. On one hand, Job knows that God is a just and fair judge, and on the other hand, he knows that he's done no wrong to warrant his terrible circumstance. Now, as Job begins to process these doubts, fundamental questions begin to surface in his mind. Would God in his infinite power oppress me? He asks in verse 6. In verse 13, he asks if God is even influenced by his pain or if he just does his own thing. Now, without doubt, these are hard questions to ask as well as to answer. But doubt was also the catalyst moving Job to seek a greater understanding of who God truly is. Now, living in doubt is an uncomfortable and a discouraging place to be, but it can be healthy when it compels us to seek answers. Many quote the verse of Jeremiah 29:11 because it gives hope for a purpose-filled future. But few continue to read on to Jeremiah 29:13, which says, "If you look for me wholeheartedly, you will find me." Now, if our doubts lead us to seek answers, God will be faithful to lead us to the truth. As Job worked through his questions and doubts, his resolution in verses 6 and 7 is that God is an honest and fair judge. Thing number 2, I want you to know that in the midst of our trial, we may also have faith that God's track record of faithfulness provides a much better sample size of his character than our current circumstances ever could. See, Job was afflicted in nearly every way that a man could be, but from this passage, we understand that Job believes God to be fair and just. He refuses to curse the name of God, even in the midst of incredible suffering. Now I ask you, what could sustain the faith of a defeated man who has absolutely nothing left? When he looks all around, he can't see God anywhere. When the world around is darkness, what is it that sustains Job? He remembers. He remembers the blessings he'd been given. He remembers who God has been throughout history. This was the same God who began a great nation from the offspring of Abraham. This is the same God that has always been faithful. He's the same God that gave victory to tiny, ill-equipped Israelite armies in order to give them a promised place of their own. The same God, the one of Moses, who took a man with a speech impediment and trust issues and led an entire nation out of slavery. You see, Job's faith remained, though he was discouraged, that God seemed to be hard to find. Though Job was in agony, he understood that his personal circumstances didn't change the character of God himself. Lastly, I want to say to you, as we wrestle with our own doubts and seek to know where God is, when we experience our fears, our hurts, our disappointments, we can understand that things are not always as they seem. There are times of darkness in our lives when God seems to have taken a vacation and left us to fend for ourselves. And again, many of us can identify with Job in verses 8 and 9 of this passage where he says, "I go east, but he's not there. I go west, but I cannot find him. I don't see him in the north, for he's hidden. I look to the south, but he is concealed." Yet we also have the benefit of knowing the end of Job's story. As we read on, we understand that God was not absent. God did care, and God blessed Job greatly because of his faith. God may have been silent in chapter 23, but I can guarantee you he was far from being absent in Job's plight. I think again to those miners in Chile, trapped in their small, cramped space with little food, water, or even fresh air. 17 days passed for them without contact from the outside world. I ask you, what kind of hope must they have had for any rescue? How many of them gave up, were resigned to their fate? Yet little did they know that above the surface, a massive rescue effort was underway to bring these men home. I wonder how often we're so lost in our own personal collapsed minds that we forget to realize that God could be putting together a massive rescue effort on our behalf if we just wait and trust in His provision. I find it very interesting to hear the stories from these men following their rescue. I've read several accounts from miners who were not particularly religious, claiming to have heard the voice of God when they were down there in those mines. In an interview with the Daily Mail, Mario Sepulveda, one of the trapped miners, spoke about God's presence in the mine. He said, and I quote, "The devil was down there and so was God. I didn't see either, but I felt both. They were in a battle for our souls, and God won." I'd argue that if God ever wanted to speak to those who refuse to listen, He would, and likely should, use the darkest, most vulnerable moments of our lives. The moments of greatest need and desperation. Sometimes that's the only place in which we're willing to hear His voice. Through your own doubts and hurts, I trust and urge you to trust in God to be who He has always promised to be. Now, that doesn't mean that trials will not come our way. But that does mean that we can maintain the faith that God has never abandoned us if we continue to listen for His voice. Now, if we do listen to His voice, we may come out of the struggle closer to God than we've ever been before. Brothers and sisters, this is what I want you to take away today. Do not be content to sit in your doubt. Seek Him with everything. Ask the hard questions, and He will be faithful to follow through. Thank you.